The name of Kenji Mizoguchi brings to mind a certain image, a certain formal tendency. One immediately thinks of a long take with gliding crane movement and varying high and low angles, as aboundingly seen in the likes of Sanshou the Bayleaf or Ugetsu. While accurate in theory, such a view, shaped by critics and availability of the films alike, has manufactured an inveterate belief of a mathematical rigidity in Mizoguchi's style that belies, if downright ignores, much of the cinema he had been engaged in prior to 1952. In fact, his career can be divided into 4 periods: the early 30s and pre-war period, the war period, the US occupation period, and the Buddhist period of the 1950s, all of which vary in stylistic and thematic approach. Of course, though coherent, this is by no means definite. Films don't perfectly slot within the individual periods, for Mizoguchi's later years showed a tendency to oscillate between film styles, moving between Western lauded Buddhist works and ostensibly lesser contemporary films that, like references back to the early 30s, focused on the lives of geishas in modern society. The trilogy of bourgeois melodramas of the early 50s deserves its own standout mention here. Rather than singularizing Mizoguchi, this means to establish the vastness that lay behind the aura of his name, as it is not so much a definite style that is prevalent for his career as a general predilection for form, as well as what Donald Kirihara in his book Patterns of Time hails an acknowledgement and subversion of filmic and social conventions. Sisters of the Gion, released in the fall of 1936 alongside its thematic sister Osaka Elegy, is among the films most often referenced when speaking of Japan's pre-war cinema. And after Osaka Elegy, the second penned by Mizoguchi's future right-hand man, screenwriter Yoshikata Yoda. Following a brief surge of so-called Kiko films, leftist films, which were formally banned by 1936, Mizoguchi, like others, avoided censor by refracting his subject matter towards gender in lieu of class, focusing on the oppression of women within society in which class is a peripheral, yet nevertheless poignant factor. As such, Sisters of the Gion centers around the lives of 2 geishas in contemporary Japan with opposing views, one traditional, the other modern. Through the figure of Omocha, the younger sister, his lens points towards the moga, the modern girl in contemporary Japan. Such are not unique elements, downright conventional at that juncture in Japanese cinema, yet what helps Mizoguchi stand out are his distancing techniques, a general defamiliarization, and a parametric narration, which Donald Kirihara expounds as the decentering of characters and psychological activity, which raises the question of the social determinants of their action. Such can be found in both the way Mizoguchi subverts character identification and his use of the Shinpa melodrama in which the film is embedded. Instead of giving tension for an eventual catharsis, he frequently withholds information and rationales not to serve the melodrama at hand, but to withhold it for withholding's sakes. As Kirihara details, Omocha beguiles and scams various men throughout the film, without having a rationale expounded. Instead, one is confronted only with the act, and through it all becomes clear. The film deliberately bathes in the ambiguity of its characters. Even the title enforces this. We don't know if they're real sisters or work-related ones. The background of the woman is never explained or discussed, nor does it matter when paired against the social situation they find themselves in. Mizoguchi establishes core characters that exist not for themselves, but for something else, the deed, a commentary. Mizoguchi does not seek sympathy in the traditional way, for identification with the characters, but for a logical deduction of their position. As such, the film is one of social roles and spatial planes. Regarding editing, Tak Gallagher's insight proves invaluable. We are presented with an editing that, unlike the Hollywoodian ideal, cuts between planes and sides, disregarding regular continuity, serving the roles the characters inhabit. Yet while notable, editing plays not yet the greatest role. Instead, the interest lay in Mizoguchi's deep focus and a long shot. The core idea behind his transformational space is one called montage within a shot, whence dynamics and conflicts are created without a cut, but rather through functional movements both by camera and actor. Most evidently, this can be seen within the seduction of the store owner Kudo by Omocha, the film's most famous sequence. Outside of its impact, it's one of the few sequences in the film with vast movement. The mise-en-scene is packed, but camera movement, and by extension actor movement within it, is limited and functional, always existing to serve a purpose. Released in 1939, falling within the war efforts of Imperial Japan and China, which had lasting effects on the national cinema, further circumscribing genres, particularly ones littered with social commentary, leaving Mizoguchi to dedicate himself to the period piece. The story of The Last Chrysanthemum is an adaptation of a highly evaluated Shinpa play. Tadao Sato describes it fittingly as a tragedy, whose tragedy lies in the lack of opposition by the woman to blatant social discrimination. It is as overt a film of female sacrifice as Mizoguchi had achieved in his late silent films. Here, the highest a woman can rise to is being beneficial to an ambitious man. Sacrifice, or rather submission to a social role, the deed she's confined to, reaches a level of self-discovery when the later films would deify more directly. As in Gi-on, we are thus directly confronted with the role. The setting of 19th century Japan is also crucial, as Kirihari points out, for how it politically reflected contemporaneous Japan, where the need for nationhood, togetherness, and nationalism was enforced and discussed. In short, Mizoguchi hides behind inoffensive period escapism, when in actuality he's tackling issues directly. Exceeding Gi-on's long shot, Chrysanthemum births a sequence shot, a more deliberate retardation of editing momentum, and by logical extension a longer shot length, which if anything approaches, if not fully announces, the later style. Editing continues to play a role, in particular during the various kabuki sequences that punctuate the film. Cut, as Noel Burge would call them, according to a quicker, western-style rhythm, designed to disorient and jar the harmony of the established languor. More than superfluous, this places direct attention on those sequences and by extension the role of the kabuki theater as a carrier of ideology in Meiji Japan. The woman's sacrifice finds itself sublated in the success of the kabuki actor, incriminating in the very act the kabuki as a cultural beacon. The position of art functions here as a representative of Japanese culture, by extension the imperial project at the time, and is slightly disavowed by Mizoguchi's emphasis on the sacrifice necessary to sustain its success. A cruel irony, as Logan Thompson notes, it's a film at odds with its own culture from inside its culture. Alongside the long take, the tracking shot finds its footing here too, most notably during the late night walk between the two lovers. Even they play into the avowed critique, in their sweepingness redolent both of what we would find more earnestly in later Mizoguchi films, and, as the so-called emakimono, what appeared a narrative staple during the Meiji era, is seen through more critical eyes. Formally, rather than establishing a centration through it, following the two walk along a path by the dog set, the camera follows unevenly. Occasionally a character takes control of part of a sequence, but then makes way. Each movement is decisive for how it advances the relationship and burgeoning love between the two, moving like figures designed to attract conflict. It's a strong formalism, whose kind we would see furthered, perhaps to an excessive amount, throughout his 1950s films. Released in 1949, My Love Burns fell within the post-war US occupation period. Democracy and liberalism were major themes imposed on the cinema of Japan and its various directors, ranging from Ozu to Kurosawa's No Regrets for Our Youth, films in which the intellectual emerges out of the narrative as the leader, where women become vectors of democracy. So was the general idea of the post-war cinema. As a result, those films were quite didactic in their preaching of Western values, of which this film by Mizoguchi is perhaps the smallest offender. It is also different for its period setting, based on the biography of Fukuda Aiko, a woman activist in the people's rights movement during the Meiji period, thereby combining contemporary themes with the classic setting Mizoguchi had ensconced in. The core idea behind My Love Burns is deeply radical. For one, it is a lucid portrayal of political self-awakening, using the democratic values imposed on filmmakers as a deeper critique of the institutions behind it. In the film, the values of democracy and resistance are inculcated into the women, who appear first as followers of male leaders, then supersede those masters with their newfound consciousness, recognizing the faults of their teachers. Kinio Tanaka's Aiko asserts herself as an equal and criticizes her former master and lover. As an equal, one demands better from the other equal. The core of democracy is to hold others to the standard. Thus, to become oneself is to transcend one's teacher. Political awakening is a two-step undertaking, first as a follower, then as leader. Throughout, Mizoguchi remains critical of the person in power, In line with requirements, he preaches democracy and liberal thought as tools for emancipation, while highlighting the duplicity of those who spread it, a comment which can be extended from the liberal leaders in the film to the world leaders at the time. The film greatly adheres to a long take during its major sequences, while mediating a lifting time through quicker, more traditional editing. Stylistically, it aligns itself closer to the Western film in how viewer identification is channeled through a singular woman, eschewing the distant style of Guion in Chrysanthemum. Released in 1952, Life of Oharu spearheaded Mizoguchi's now much remembered run that lasted until his death in 1956, building part of the collection that had dictated critical and popular understanding of him until now. It came amidst a wave of renewed interest in Japanese cinema in the West that saw festival success for the likes of Ozu and Kurosawa. As such, Mizoguchi in these Buddhist films drew a subject from a world of Japanese tradition, merged with Buddhist ideas of redemption and absolution, playing largely in pre-modern eras. Consciously or not, Mizoguchi managed to exploit the exoticism of Western audiences for his own good, while simultaneously remaining within the period of expertise and comfort. In Oharu, the plight of woman is picked up anew and virtually deified. Oharu finds herself repelled by society, yet accepted by the divine. Identification as we find it in My Love Burns is slightly lacking. In spite of the film's narrowed lens, Oharu specifically seems to have no actual personality and assumes every societal role she's assigned to, a perfect object of fetishism, if you will. Oharu signals a combination of Mizoguchi and Tanaka as collaborators. In previous iterations, Tanaka played the role of seductress and seduced alike, alternating between the two. Here, Tanaka is presented as the eternally seduced, be it by the servant of the opening sequence, who shares such eloquently built tension that fainting, as a result of clashing social hierarchy and desire, is the only resolution, or throughout the film. Character presence, as Chita Kinoshita argues, has altered Mizoguchi's approach over the years, moving from the montage within a shot and a direct focus of the camera, where movement is functional, to a choreography of desire, which foregrounds the actor, but granting it ceaseless movement. As such, the deep focus, which had dominated earlier film, ceases ascendancy, and instead we find the emakimono, the smooth continuity style in its full form. Noel Birch famously lambasted these films for their turning-a-page-style composition, analogous to Visconti's The Leopard, where Mizoguchi's previous radicality appears totally subservient to a stylized version of the dominant code. Regardless of its validity, in the critique itself, we see a stark change in style, so noticeable that it prevents many simple generalizations. As we have seen, Mizoguchi, who had been quoted an apolitical director, belies some of those accusations here. Granted, there's enormous variety, downright even contradiction in Mizoguchi throughout the years. Sato notes the increasing alignment with Western codes during the latter period, settling for simple identification. Likewise, the trend towards period pieces, ostensibly chasing Western acclaim, the idea of self-exoticism that found its peak in Sanshou and Ugetsu, may have attributed heavily to the general notion of him as an opportunist. Further, he did disavow the leftist Keiko films during the 30s, which seemingly betrays all but a personality of little conviction. It is important to note that Mizoguchi essentially directed and lived through 4 iterations of Japan, an indication they are found directly in both his variant filmmaking and political temerity. What results out of this should be a reluctance to place a consistent label onto him. Yet nevertheless, one of the few things to remain consistent is that most of his films procure a discussion on oppressive social roles, evidently at the core of Gion, Chrysanthemum, My Love Burns, and even Oharu, which is of but great political value. What else could it be? What also remains consistent is Mizoguchi's acknowledgement of certain political social norms embedded in the film's text that find their subversion in his form. As such, both the imperial propaganda as well as the late Buddhist films can appear progressive. Stylistically, we see frequent shifts, the sharp, conscious dialectic of form from his earlier period, finding its peak with Chrysanthemum, replaced by a more innate, controlled, and sublated approach in the later Buddhist films. Thus, generalizations of long, sweeping shots are helpful, but limited, as those tend to be. They lose the intrinsic values of the individual films in hopes of a grand statement. Of course, aside from the political, there are commonalities that all Mizoguchi share, a specific detail to the frame and its external spaces, or what Sato refers to as arranging the form, an inherent understanding of cinema as primarily visual. Many understand this, of course, but few have mastered it as integrally as Mizoguchi, a metaphysical principle on whose basis the film can be constructed. That's why Mizoguchi's films are always beautiful, always moving, not because he wants to make them so, but because he can't do anything but make them so. That is Mizoguchi.